will you make that picnic blanket over there dry? Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Okay, God, don't be mad, but can you do me one more favor? In the morning, can the grass be dry and the blanket will be wet, and then I'm all in? Raise your hand if that conversation sounds vaguely familiar. Oh, good. You've probably read it in the Bible or heard about it in church, and that's a conversation that Gideon had with God. Raise your hand if that's a conversation maybe that you've had with God. Oh, good. We got some honest people in there. All right. I'm going to ask that my assistants come and help me set up. One of the funny things is one of my assistants, I said, Lucy, I need a Vanna White. And she looks at me and says, who's Vanna White? So I had to explain to her. This morning, we're going to talk about living fearlessly. And if this was a college course, we would name it Living Fearlessly 101. We're going to look at one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and it's the story of Gideon. Now, why only 101 class? Well, we're going to see that Gideon needed some nudging to live fearlessly for God. And I kind of identify with that sometimes. If we were talking about Paul or David, then we'd probably be talking about a junior or senior level class. But this morning, we're going to talk about the basics of responding to God's call in our lives to live fearlessly. Oh, I forgot to let the kids go. Kids, you're free to go. All righty, we're doing some housekeeping. But today, we're going to look at the basics of living fearlessly for God. I have to apologize. How many of you just love the fill-in-the-blank inserts? Oh, see, when Ben called me this earlier this week, he says, George, I need your slides. I said, okay. He goes, and are you going to do an insert, a fill-in-the-blank insert? And I said, no. Because I was thinking, I don't want to have to, remember what words or... But I have a solution for you. In your bulletin, there's a note section, right? And we have worked... Oh, I love it. But we have worked to keep the slides really short. And if you just write down what's on the slides, you will have a nice fill-in-the-blank outline. All righty? Okay. So let's explore the story of Gideon. And I thought we might, and the story of Gideon comes from Judges chapter 6. That's the part we're looking at. And I thought we might try something a little interactive this morning. And I was hoping you could help me tell the story of Gideon. So behind me, over here with my lovely assistant, we have some of the key moments in the story, but they're out of sequence. So what we need to do is put them in sequence, and as we do that, we'll tell the story. All righty, who's up for the challenge? Oh, there's my first volunteer. And Bill, what do you think what is the first guess? Oh, let me go through our options for those of you that are sitting maybe in the back row. Our options are, the key moments are victory. Woo! Come on. Woo! Yeah. All right. Picnic, blanket, bingo. All right. Listening to nighttime stories. Gideon toots his horn. Gideon realizes he's talking to the AOL. Now, this is not the Bible foreseeing the internet. Okay. AOL, I needed room. It was the angel of the Lord. Okay. So, and then we go to, if God is for us, torches and trumpets, Gideon tears down the altar of Baal. Anyone afraid? Well, then you can go home. AOL appears to Gideon and testing the drinking water. So Bill was our first volunteer. Do you have a guess, Bill?
Yes, for whatever it is.
First key moment.
For the first key moment, I pick AOL appears to Gideon.
Excellent. Give Bill a hand. Excellent job. Excellent job. Now, the second one might be a little difficult, but as I'm walking this over, does anybody else have a guess what the second one? Ed.
Gideon realizes he's talking to the
Gideon realizes he's talking. That is close, but not the second one that I'm looking for. Does anybody else have a guess? Anybody? Come on, we're talking about living fearlessly. Eleanor.
God is for us.
Oh, good. I thought we might be here all day. That one's kind of the hard one. But how'd you get that one, Eleanor?
Oh, I had a hint.
Oh, from my aha. Well, good. Boy, if this was what's the Wheel of Fortune? No. Vanna White. Oh, man, we'd have a scandal on our hands. Vanna can't be pointing to the letters. Okay, now we need the third one. Ed. Excellent job, Ed. Excellent job. Okay, I think that's a good chunk. Let's get into the story here. So, AOL appears to Gideon. The angel of the Lord, sitting under an oak tree near where Gideon's hanging out, and he says to Gideon, "The Lord is with you, strong and mighty warrior." And Gideon says, "Excuse me?" Because Gideon was hiding out. The Midianites were a neighboring marauding group nation, and they would come every harvest time and they would steal the crops that the Israelites were harvesting, and they would trample the fields. So Gideon, the Israelites would hurry up and harvest what they could, but when they were threshing the grain, getting it from the stalks, they were doing that in places like a wine press or a cellar. And that's where Gideon is. He's kind of in this hole in the ground, hiding out to make sure that nobody comes and takes his grain. And Gideon responds, "Well, hold up. If God is for us, then how come all of this is going on? What happened to all the wonders that God did for us? What happened to the stories that my parents and my grandparents told us about when you rescued us from Egypt and you saved us through the wilderness?" He says, if God is for us, then how come this is happening? And somewhere in that conversation, Gideon realizes, oh no, I'm talking to the angel of the Lord. And in that conversation, he kind of has this, oops. And so he says, wait here. And he goes and he gets a young goat, because that's what you do when you're talking to the angel of the Lord, right? Abraham did it. They go, oh, wait, and let me fix you some dinner. So he brings it to the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord didn't eat it, but he said, set it on the rock, pour the broth and the bread over, make a pile. And fire came up out of the rock and consumed that sacrifice. But Gideon realized, oh, wait, I'm talking to God here. All righty? So let's pick 3 more. What do we think the next 3 are? Picnic blanket bingo. That is close, but not quite.
Victory, because we all have victory in Jesus.
Somebody's jumping way ahead over there. Yes, Alice. Okay. No. Bill's. Oh, Karen thinks she's got it. Tears down the altar bell. Vanna? That is right. Good job, Karen. You can go put it over there. Let's keep going. How about the next one? After he tears down the altar bell. Do you want a hint? Back here in the back row. Almost. Gideon toots his horn. I heard it. And can you? I don't imagine a little trumpet. I imagine like something from Lord of the Rings, where they got those big old horns. And this was a call to the army. He's calling out the army, and it's a brrr, and it echoes across the mountains. Right? All right. We need one more, and I think Jenny had it. Woohoo! Good job. Okay, so let's keep going on our story. After Gideon has this conversation, God speaks to him a couple of nights later, and he says, here's what I want you to do, Gideon. The Israelites had been worshiping Baal and Ashtoreth, which were false gods. And he says, I want you to go tear down the altar that your dad has built to Baal that's up there on the hill. I want you to tear it down. And take the pole, the Asherah pole, and cut it up. And I want you to build a proper altar to me. Use that Asherah pole and go sacrifice the oxen, that second oxen that is in your dad's herd. So he did. He did it at night, though. And he got 10 of his servants to do it with him. I think he was still a little bit afraid, huh? In the morning, the town lost their minds. Who did that? They said, we're going to kill him. And they figured out who it was, because when you involve 10 servants, somebody's going to rat you out. Right? So the town, they come pounding on his dad's door, and his dad says, listen, I think Baal, if he's really a god, can defend himself. So why don't you let Baal deal with my son if he really is a god? Because we need to serve the Lord, the true God. All righty. And then he doesn't get killed by the townspeople, which is good. And then the Lord says, okay, Gideon, it's time. And that's where he blows that big horn. And it's not just a toot, 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 toot. It is a signal to gather the army. So he's gathering the army. They are under occupation by the Midians. What would you do if you're the occupying force to any rebel or would-be rebel leader who blows and calls out the army? You're going to take him out, right? So Gideon again is taking his life into his own hands by calling out the army. And the army responds, right? And so the army's gathered. And Gideon is still feeling a little bit afraid. And that's where he has that conversation with God. And he says, hey, God, are you sure? And God says, okay, you want to test me? And so he did. God says, okay, blanket's dry. Oh, you got another test? Okay. Bingo, the blanket's wet. What we need to remember is that Gideon is in at this point. And so let's get back to and so what happens to the next, let's go with the next 2. We're not looking for 3, we're looking for 2 this time. Army is gathered. Natalie. Woo, good job. Nice job. Okay. And we need 1 more. Ed. Excellent. And you know why I wrote it like this, Ed? Because this week we've got to get our well water tested. So I thought, oh, there you go. It kind of just made sense to me. All righty. So Gideon has called out the army. Anybody have a guess at how many soldiers or army from the Israelites gathered?
10,000.
Close. You're only off by 22,000. It was 32,000 Israelites gathered. How many Midianites do you think there are? There was 4 to 1. It was 4 to 1. That's a hint. Midianites are 120,000 against 32,000. Okay? Those are the odds. You can see why maybe Gideon was going, well, Lord, are you really sure you want me to do this? And am I the guy? God says, okay, Gideon, you had a couple tests for me. I've got a couple for you. He says, you got too many. Because I don't want to rescue you guys and then you guys take all the credit. Even though the odds are still 4 to 1 against you, you are too many. And he says, I want you to announce that anybody who's afraid can go home. How many people do you think went home? It was Ed's first guess. 10,000 left. 10,000 just said, okay, you're going to let me go home? I'm out of here. And so you had 22,000 people left. Now the odds are 6 to 1. It's getting worse. And then God says, Gideon, my buddy, one more time. I want you to take them down the river, take them down the water, and then I'll show you which ones I want. And so he takes them down, and it's testing the drinking water. And if they stuck their face in the water, God says, nope, I don't want you. But if they stayed down there, kind of keeping their eyes on the hills, those are the ones God wanted. So now Gideon doesn't have 22,000. He doesn't have 10,000. God leaves him with 300. 300 people. The odds went from 4 to 1 to now 400 to 1. All righty. Let's see. We've got 3 more. Let's put them in order. It should be getting closer. I need somebody to live fearlessly. Somebody who hasn't given us a guess. Damon. Torches and trumpets. Almost. Do you have another guess? Oh, sweet. Nice job. Way to go, Damon. All righty. And the next key moment. Helen, you got a guess? Oh, Helen, you rock. All righty. Woo. And how about the last one? Anybody got a good guess? Victory. Woo-hoo! Victory. All righty. Thank you, Vanna. And you can sit down now, Vanna. Okay. So, For years I have listened. Remember, Gideon is my favorite story, one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And for years I have suffered through preachers beating up on Gideon. Okay? And we're getting to one of my favorite spots in the story where Gideon has already taken his life into his own hands a couple times. God has reduced his numbers from 32,000 to 300. Is Gideon asking God for any more proof? No. Did God beat him up? When you read the story, God doesn't beat up Gideon like all these preachers that I've listened to over the years beat him up. God doesn't beat him up for having some doubts. What he does is he says, Gideon, buddy, if you're still a little bit afraid, here's what I want you to do. I want you to sneak down to the enemy camp where the guards are stationed around the perimeter. I want you to sneak down there and listen to what they're saying. And so Gideon is crawling on his belly. He's got his armor bearer next to him because, Gideon doesn't do anything by himself. So he's crawling on his belly. And he gets right up close to one of the guard stations. And he listens. And that just as they're changing guards, the guard who's coming to relieve the guard who was leaving says, I just had the craziest dream. And he goes, really, what was it? He says, there was this giant loaf of bread, of barley bread. And he says, and it was rolling down the hill, and it bounced and smashed our tent. He goes, that is crazy. And the guy who is relieving says, oh no, that can only mean one thing. And I'm thinking, how can that only mean one thing? But he says, that can only mean one thing. God, the loaf of bread is Gideon, and God is going to use Gideon to wipe us out. That was what the enemy was thinking. And Gideon, with his ear low to the ground, heard that story. So God wasn't beating up on Gideon. He says, you need a little more reassurance? Here you go. So Gideon went back and he says, guys, we're going to win. And he divides them up, and the torches were real torches, and they had jars over the top to keep them dark. And they had trumpets, and there were only 300 of them, right? So they surrounded, the Midianites were camped in the valley, and they surrounded 120,000 people with 300. But it's dark, and God had already set the stage. They smashed on the sound, all together, coordinated. They smashed their jars. The torches come. The trumpets blast. It must have been echoing off the canyon walls. Like, how many have been to the Bass Lake fireworks show? I love that fireworks show, not for the fireworks, but for the echo off the canyon, where it just echoes and echoes. And I can imagine that God turned up the volume on the trumpets, and that the Midianites came running out of their tents, and they panicked. It's dark. All they see are these torches coming down to them, and they can probably imagine that there are 400 to each torch and each trumpet. They think that they're getting wiped out, and they start killing each other in their panic. All through the night, they're panicked and killing each other. Morning breaks, and all those people that went home that were afraid now heard what's going on. And over the next few days, they joined the attack, and they pushed the Midianites out of their country for good. And God used Gideon to do all of that. God is calling us to live fearlessly for Him. So, here's our text. You thought that was our text. I'm just getting started. All righty? So here's our text. 2 Timothy 1, chapter 1, verse 7. For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Let's say that together. For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Let's start with the first one. For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power. We need to remember three things this morning. And here's the first one. We need to remember who we're talking to. When we're facing something big, we need to remember who we're talking to. Gideon realized this. Remember when he went and got the goat? All of a sudden he has that oops moment. He goes and prepares the goat and presents it because he realized, he remembered who he was talking to. Folks, we serve the God of the universe, the maker of all things. If he's calling us to do something or face something that seems too big for us, we need to remember who we're talking to. There's nothing too big for God. In fact, remember the part of the story where God told Gideon, you have too many men? You're too big? God is in the business of using the weak and the small to defeat the big and the strong in this world. That's what he does. If God is for us, who can be against us? And that brings us to the second thing that we need to remember this morning. For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love. We need to remember what God has done for us. Gideon did this, though he kind of did it for the wrong reasons. Remember when he first started talking to the angel of the Lord, he says, Lord, if God is for us, then what about all the things that he did? How come they aren't happening now? What about all those things that God did? And Gideon listed all those things. Throughout history, God rescues, he saves, and he comes to the aid of those he loves. The cross is our picture of that. The picture of God acting on behalf of the ones he loves. We need to remember what he's done for us. There's an old church song that is called Count Your Blessings. And the words are, count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings. See what God has done. And I love that song because it was like a peppy gospel song and the organ would be bouncing. It was awesome. But when we remember what God has done for us, what that does is it encourages our hearts. We can't help but be fearless when we start listing all the things that God has done for us, because it gives us courage and it gives us a boldness to live fearlessly for him. The third thing we need to remember, for God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. This one we need to remember to keep our ear to the ground. Remember to keep our ear to the ground. Remember when Gideon was crawling through the woods up to that guard station with his ear close to the ground, and as he lifted his head, God says, here you go, buddy. The enemy is more afraid than you are. And that reminds me, and that picture of Gideon on his belly with his ear close to the ground reminds me of one of the most formative pieces of advice I ever got. As a young man, late teens, early 20s, I was wrestling with what does God want me to do? I wanted to serve God. I wanted to do what he wanted me to. I wanted to launch into the life that he had for me. But I just wasn't sure. There were a lot of choices. And I was wrestling with that. I was stressing out about how to figure that out. And my dad gave me this advice. And it applies still today. I have used it for the last 30 years. And it's something that we can use today. He said, George, and that was a big if you're pursuing God and you're wanting what's best, what he wants for you, then you need to do two things. He says, assume God's got you where he wants you. And I thought, if we're pursuing God and we're really wanting what he has for us, we can rest and assume that he's got us where he wants us. And the second piece of that was keep your ear to the ground. And it was kid growing up on old westerns, I would imagine that Indian that was keep listening to the ground. And he says, George, God will use the circumstances in your life to nudge you in the way he wants you to go. All you have to do is keep your ear to the ground. Quiet yourself, be still, and pay attention. And God will use those circumstances to nudge you. So, this morning, there are some of us who are facing some big things. Some of them are exciting, some of them are kind of scary. God's calling all of us to live fearlessly for him. And we need to remember, we need to remember who we're talking to. We need to remember what God has done for us. And we need to remember to keep our ear to the ground. I'm going to ask the band to come up as I close in prayer. Lord, thank you for this morning. I needed to hear this as much as anybody here today, because you are pushing and stretching me in areas that I've gotten pretty comfortable. I feel you nudging. And I want to be known as somebody who says yes to you, who says yes to a life more fearless to you. Amen.